And good day, everybody. This is David Cross again. I want to follow up on the import DNS cloud automation appliance workflow. Mouthful there. And talk about a few things in terms of scaling the Node-RED and scaling some of the workflows, how to troubleshoot, things that I've kind of run across, and maybe some observations that I've seen, and kind of go over a few details and changes, because I think that as you progress and start dealing with file uploads, if that is intended, or dealing with large capacity memory or strings, you're going to run into potentially some memory issues. So let's go ahead and cover it now and talk about things that you can do to overcome that. So first of all, I am running, again, this is my lab server, and I can't stress it enough, run these things in a lab first and make sure it works. So as I was running this import procedure before, and we saw on the video, it was importing the resource records extremely fast, very quick, and that worked great up to a certain point. I then had some transfers, and I decided, after some discussion with a peer of mine, about size. And, I had never considered, going with a very large zone. So I created a million record DNS record zone, and I hosted it on my server. And so what I then decided to do and did is started running this process, and I started finding out I was choking with out of memory errors, and the memory was exceeding a couple gigabytes and so on and so forth. And it took a lot of time to get around this. And so here's what I ended up with. And I found that this particular command is what fixed this for me in terms of memory, but then also some other things in terms of Node and others. So first of all, let's talk about the way you start up Node-RED. And again, I'm assuming you're on a lab, on a Linux server. And if you're doing this on a cloud automation appliance, you may or may not have access to this, but I don't know that you will. And I don't know that the memory would be sufficient unless you're in a virtual environment. So this is assuming Linux, assuming some type of control over the process. Now on the Node-RED, and I'm starting mine up with a no-hop, and I'm running it in the background, in the node-red space dash dash, and then it's max dash old dash space dash size equals, and round to the 1024 byte size of memory. And so I had to set mine to 16 gigabytes, or I thought I did based on some of the memory growth, but I might be able to tune this back. However, I noticed it was still up around 4 to 6 gig when I was stressing it pretty heavily. So that's the very, very first thing is, and note also that you'll have to restart this for the setting to take effect. Now, I also had looked into my settings files, and within the Node-RED directory, you should have your settings.js. And in that file, I had looked at a memory upload, and I think that there was a file size uh, maximum that you could say for what size file you could upload. So I had to change mine, and the capacity from what I could read through, and I believe this to be correct, is the setting this to API max length is the size of the file. And so because we're using the HTTP node for a file upload, I also did update this to represent at least a gigabyte file, although that's probably even still stressing it with 16 gig of memory, depending on what you do with the message and processing. So those two changes, again, restarting Node-RED when you're done, should complete and give you at least the memory capacity to do some of this. Now, I'm kind of going back to the flow that I had worked on and some of the observations I made in terms of capacity. And I'm going to kind of demonstrate this briefly in a second. Number one is when I started doing the import before I started running out of memory, I was doing the import domain record directly into IP control. So as I was reading records off the stack, I was also processing them. And on the client side, the file upload just looked like it was processing forever and ever. And I think eventually it timed out. And then, of course, we lost any web session. So the first thing is I wanted to just drop it off again and just say upload the file. When the file, end session is complete, just go ahead and return it back to the client. So that was the very, very first thing that I wanted to do. The second is I actually disconnected the import domain because I needed to get over some capacity planning, dealing with this memory issue, and then also trying to figure out ways to troubleshoot. And lastly, performance in terms of processing the data. So here's where I came to the change. So the first part is I was previously processing the buffer through the message rec files array and converting that to a string and then processing the string. I'm not going to do that again. I'm not going to convert it. I just want to set the payload to that value so that the next node in the process, since it looks for a payload, will be able to process this. So number one change. Number two, there is a file node, both in and output nodes. These are intended to help you write files, write data to a file based on its asynchronous writing capabilities, and then also the ability to read files and then to stream or split or do some other things, which I'll get to shortly. So the first thing is, and I'm hard coding this, but I am going to come back and dynamically make this multi-user configurable. But I created a file, and this is a setting up a different directory, but the node and the storage of this, if left on just a file name and not fully qualified, will be relative to where your node-RED instance is applied. The actions that I'm going to have here, you can append, delete, or override. I'm just going to override it. I'm just assuming each time it's going to read and overwrite. I'm going to add a new line to each payload. So if there's, any additional payloads in there, I want to go ahead and add the new line if it's not there, and then create the directory, if it's there or not. I don't know if I need that. And then I'm encoding UTF-8. It does have a default, which I believe is your system, but I'm going to do this anyway. So this then takes that buffer, puts it in payload. Payload gets passed into the file. This gets written out to a text file, and then I delete the payload. And I'm not going to actually use that memory for this process. And I believe that's going to free it up, as what I found is a 1 meg file, or 1 million record file, was about 48 megabytes. So that was 48 meg of RAM, and possibly more being used in terms of its space. So I delete it to get rid of the payload. And now I'm going to read this. And in the input node, again, I'm hard coding, later dynamic. The output of this, I'm actually going to tell it to use a message per line, meaning it does actually handle the splits. I'm going out on a limb and assuming, because this is included with Node, that they probably handle the memory better, the streaming and capabilities better than what I'm doing with converting buffers to a big 48 meg string and then splitting it and processing. So I'm going to use this node then, and I found performance-wise that saving it and reading it back in almost instantaneously, I was getting results. As in before, I was waiting a couple of minutes for the processing of the buffer. So one message per string is what I found worked really well with this. Now, I'm not sure about the stream of buffers or the buffer object. These might be very efficient and manageable, which I might do as well, and set that up. The send message on error, maybe we can trap this or do something else, but I'm going to show you the status node. And then the coding, I'm going to leave the same. All right, so this actually read it back in and it split it. And then I had all of my other code was already intact. So effectively what I did then is I set up the node here, and I'm doing a couple other things so that I can keep track of what's happening, within the node. So as I was processing a couple of records, it's easy to go back and look at a zone and see which records had errors. When you're processing a million records, I couldn't tell why I was getting an error in certain instances, and this has helped out tremendously. So the first thing is I set up two different variables: a count, which is going to be the total count processed, and then a batch, which I'm going to set up as 1,000. I can set this batch up to be 5,000, 10,000, and then actually maybe we'll do this at 5,000 since we're, dealing in million here. So in the batch and the count, it's going ahead and do a count and set the variable. And it's either going to pull it from a node context, meaning just this function node and its counter, or it's going to set to 0 internal. Now the batch, I then increment it, and then if it's less than or equal to 5 is where I want to start processing and setting some status information. So this new process here says if the batch is less than the number we just changed, check the context.set and set it at the current batch number, meaning within the 1 million records I'm processing 5,000 records. Within that 5,000 records, I'm on record 271, if that's the instance. And if it's not less than 5,000 or equal to 5,000, go ahead and set the status to the count itself, so it shows us the processing and then shows us effectively what the context variable is, which is going to give us more accuracy versus trying to process this in each loop, which is really intensive, I found. Don't do this in a for loop processing the million records, or you're going to have to update the status a million times. I'm going to do this every 5,000 records, which is effectively what I'm going to do. And then I'm going to reset the counts and the batch and everything, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so that's where I'm setting it here. So I set the context here, the set batch to 0 when it's less than, or greater than 5,000. This then sets a status, resets that to 0, and then it starts to count again. Right. So that gives me some indicator of what I'm looking at. And then I had a couple variables here that I set for the count variable, and the count plus equals to set this, so we're actually getting the actual count of the payload being processed. And that was it. And I just had to have some type of status. I was trying to figure out what's going on and what were things going on there. Now, the other part of this is each of these nodes, and what we're going to do is we're going to process a status while that's happening. And let me see if I can go ahead and just kick this off. And so let me just show you the file here, show the upload. And what I started to do is I have this transfer file, and as you can see, it's 47 meg. And this is a zone that I created in that last, it's called big domain.int. And this 47 meg is going to get uploaded to that node red, and it's going to get processed. And then I'm going to store it just into a MongoDB now, so that I have some way of saying, okay, I've read all the records, I made sure I created all the records, and there are our context. Now I want to start another process so that I can better manage and control the outcome. And if there's any errors in between there, and then start another capability. So I'm going to have to come back with another function to do that. But this has been important, so I think it is still, key to understand. So I'm going to go ahead and just, throw that file up there. You'll see here I've got it just returning an empty payload, and that's it. It's already sent the 48 meg file. It's already saved it. It's deleted the payload, and it's already read it. And now it's reading it in line by line and creating a record, which is in this context right now being set up to import into a MongoDB in real time. So it's creating all these records for us and everything in real time and doing this. And so I found now I can process a million resource record zone without running out of memory now that I've updated it to 16 gig. And I can process this in a database so I can later come back and again modify it and also track the status. Because boy, that was just a pain trying to figure that out. So if you're dealing with large files and things, you might want to save it off and read it back in as a way to do that. And then in the memory capacity, I've got 32 gig here, it's 12 gig free. When I was running in this and trying to convert the buffer and having to deal with messages, and I was duplicating some, I just quickly ran out of memory and it just wasn't capable. So check your memory. If you're running this virtual, up your memory, 32 gig, maybe even more, depending on how many functions or workflows you're going to have. And then take a look at ways that you can monitor this. Now, the very last thing I wanted to show you, and this is it here, is the status node. And this gives you the ability that you can check the status of every node and select which ones or all. And what this will then do is it'll allow you to send the output. And I'm running the latest build 20 of Node-RED. So this has the system console option for output. Make sure yours does too. And what this will do then is allow you to deploy just the modified nodes, which will change just the ones we've maybe made changes to. Everything in the background processing still continues, and it's processing elsewise. But now what we're going to see is in the status node itself, it presents a bunch of output in real time, which we could turn into, again, that very introspective detail per transaction level monitoring that we really might need in a 24/7 API shop. So a few things I wanted to keep in mind there. I've been really doing some simple things, and like I said, I'll get into some scalability and some performance checks. This seems to work for me, so I'm going to build on this and hopefully come back with some other updates with a better status and something that works that I can then demonstrate in some level of detail. So take care, everybody. I hope this helps, and I hope you didn't hit any roadblocks I might have, and if you have, a good place to look. Take care, and see you soon.